History as it happens, June 21st, 2022. An impossible divorce.
The energy crisis has not yet overwhelmed us, but it will if we do not act quickly.
Today's OPEC increases are expected to drive the price of unleaded up to a national average of 77 cents per gallon.
That poses a grave threat to the free movement of Middle East oil.
Second, Iraqi troops crossed the border into Kuwait, and its army...
Elements of the 82nd Airborne Division, as well as key units of the United States Air Force, are arriving today to take up defensive positions in Saudi Arabia.
World Trade Center, and we have unconfirmed reports this morning that a plane has crashed into one of the towers of the World Trade Center.
President Biden promised to treat Saudi Arabia as a pariah, but reality has imposed itself on a relationship that spans decades, shaped by oil, war, terrorism, and political expediency. The Crown Prince may have the blood of a Washington Post columnist on his hands, but the U.S. and the Saudis, well, they need each other. There will be no divorce. The messy marriage lives on, and that's next, as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Today, Congress gave families of 9/11 victims the right to sue Saudi Arabia.
Obama administration has been lobbying members of Congress on the side of the Saudis.
That the Saudis still appear to be protecting charities associated with the royal family, which funnel money to terrorists.
A U.S. intelligence report has concluded that Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman personally approved the murder of the exiled journalist Jamal Khashoggi in 2018.
With that being said, Saudi Arabia has been a very important ally of ours in the Middle East.
And I would make it very clear, we were not going to, in fact, sell more weapons to them. We were going to, in fact, make them pay the price and make them, in fact, the pariah that they are.
From the start, I would say this, and increasingly in the 1970s, like you imagine, the Saudis understand they need the United States to guarantee their security, but it's a gamble.
November 2019, before the pandemic upended our lives, when there was still something like a dozen Democrats crowding debate stages, Andrea Mitchell asked candidate Biden what he would do about Saudi Arabia after U.S. intelligence determined the kingdom's de facto ruler, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, ordered the murder of Jamal Khashoggi.
President Trump has not punished senior Saudi leaders. Would you?
Yes, and I said it at the time. Khashoggi was, in fact, murdered and dismembered, and I believe in the order of the Crown Prince. And I would make it very clear, we were not going to, in fact, sell more weapons to them. We were going to, in fact, make them pay the price and make them, in fact, the pariah that they are. There's very little social redeeming value in the present government in Saudi Arabia. And I would also, as pointed out, I would end the subsidies that we have, end the sale of material to the Saudis, who they're going in and murdering children and they're murdering innocent people. And so they have to be held accountable.
Biden won praise for that answer, which was a lot different than President Trump's response when he was asked whether the murder would alter the U.S.-Saudi marriage.
If you look at Saudi Arabia, they're an ally and they're a tremendous purchaser of not only military equipment, but other things. When I went there, they committed to purchase $450 billion worth of things and $110 billion worth of military. Those are the biggest orders in the history of this country, probably the history of the world. I don't think there's ever been any order for $450 billion. And you remember that day in Saudi Arabia where that commitment was made. So they're an important ally, but I want to find out what happened, where is the fault, and we will probably know that by the end of the week. But Mike Pompeo is coming back. We're going to have a long talk.
Why not send the FBI over? We're talking about a man who lived across the river in Virginia. Why not send the FBI in to figure all this out?
Well, he wasn't a citizen of this country, for one thing, and we're going to determine that. And you don't know whether or not we have, do you?
And while Biden hasn't adopted Trump's wording, he is bowing to a certain reality by announcing he will attend a regional security meeting in Saudi Arabia where he will meet MBS. In a sense, it's unavoidable for an American president to visit another country and not be in the same room as that country's leader. Maybe President Biden wishes it could be different. In fact, Americans for some time now have wondered why the U.S. maintains such a tight relationship, recent tensions notwithstanding, with an autocratic monarchy with a backwards economy and a lousy human rights record. A government accused by the relatives of the Americans killed on 9/11 of assisting the al-Qaeda hijackers, 15 of whom were Saudi citizens. Those families are suing Saudi Arabia and are lobbying our government to release the results of a secret FBI investigation into potential links between the Saudi royals and the 9/11 hijackers. Well, history can help explain how we got to this point, especially the history after 1970 and a certain three-letter word, oil. Bob Vitalis is an expert on the Middle East and energy policy. He teaches political science at the University of Pennsylvania, and he is the author of Oilcraft, The Myths of Scarcity and Security That Haunt U.S. Energy Policy. Bob Vitalis, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Martin. It's great to be here.
So President Biden will be heading to the kingdom, and the initial reaction in some corners of the media was, well, it's about gas prices. What is behind Biden's move?
I think the one that most people think about. I mean, it's a kind of desperate ploy to demonstrate one is trying to do something about the high price of gasoline because it's such a political albatross for him going up, to the elections, right? But I say desperate because I defy you to find anywhere or anyone who could do the following. It would be very simple to do, but it's never done. For someone in the Biden administration to explain, here's what the Saudis can do for us based on data, based on evidence, based on what my economists tell me, not what common sense tells me. Because the common sense or conventional wisdom is that the Saudis control the world oil market and all they need to do is pump a little more and things will be hunky-dory. Well, that's not how things work. So what I would love to see is the administration's economic analysis that shows that the Saudis have this amount of spare capacity, where they're willing to put it on the market. Price of crude oil is likely to go down by X% over, Y number of weeks or months, and somehow be rational about this in the way that we typically are when we make determinants about economic policy. But the reality is they're just guessing basically. And they're just hoping, by going there that somehow, the Saudis will respond positively and it will be kind of irrelevant what actually happens down the road because it's anybody's guess what will happen. They don't have good data on this. So it's a Hail Mary pass from my perspective.
How much does the U.S. still rely on Saudi Arabian oil?
We don't. That's another one of these pieces of conventional wisdom that everyone believes. So my students believe it must be that we're importing all this oil from Saudi Arabia because, as they always say to me, why else would we have the Fifth Fleet, in the Persian Gulf for decades? But as you know, I think the latest figures were something like about 7 or 8% of oil that had been imported into the United States over whatever period is being measured the past few months or a half year. It's about 8 or 9% from Saudi Arabia. It has never depended on Saudi oil. That said, that's not the issue, right? Not how much oil is physically coming in from Saudi Arabia to the United States, but basically it's what is the world price of oil? Right. So economists these days use a really clever little metaphor. They basically sort of say, think about the world as one big bathtub, OK, or the world oil supply as one big bathtub. And we're all drawing from that same bathtub. So if there's cutoff in some places, you need replacement from other places. Otherwise, as the level of the bathtub, lowers, the price of oil is going to go up. So it's really the fact that the price that refiners are paying for crude oil, whether it's sourced inside the United States or from Canada or from Mexico or from Indonesia or from Saudi Arabia, that price is being set on a world market, basically. So you could say something like this: there is no way to insulate yourself from disruptions in world oil supply or price rises, right, as we're experiencing right now, even if we dropped our imports from Saudi Arabia down to zero, or even if we stopped importing, we can't, but even if we stopped importing any oil whatsoever from other countries, unless we erected a protectionist regime, the price in the United States would still be set on the world market because our own oil producers are competing, in that same market.
People, myself included, do not know how the price of a gallon of gasoline is set or comes about. There is no magic button in the Oval Office. I do know that, where the president can, hit the button and bring down the price of gasoline. So this is really complicated. But in politics, complication is not something we always want to talk about. So to my initial question about the determinants behind U.S. foreign policy, I think we've covered oil here on this upcoming trip. But what else? I mean, there's got to be more than oil on the agenda.
Historically, there have been a number of domains or arenas or areas that have benefited the United States. The most obvious one these days is that the Saudis are an arms buyer, a fantastic arms buyer for domestic industry. So they have a lot of dollars, and they're willing to spend them on our military. And of course, once you started spending on military purchases and goods, et cetera, it's very hard to switch out. And sometimes, they invest some in Chinese missiles, et cetera, so that the United States doesn't take us for granted. But they really are a military deeply tied to the United States defense industries and to all those folks who train them in these weapons and so forth.
And
so
using those weapons in the war in Yemen, which is something that
unfortunately.
Biden administration's been supposedly trying to end that war by pressuring the Saudis to end the war in Yemen. I mean, to your point about weapon sales, I mean, is that something that's going to potentially be discussed here? Other regional security matters with Iran?
Oh, I'm sure they're going to want to discuss regional security matters, right? I mean, I just discovered a new acronym, I2U2, which is Israel, India, the United States, and the United Arab Emirates, this new cluster of 4 strategic, not partners that would be putting too strong a tie to it, but a kind of notion that these 4 states have these burgeoning interests in a security relationship, right? So for sure, they're going to be talking about various ways, various elements of regional security. And Iran is definitely there as number one, because Iran is really a problem for the Israelis, really a problem for the Saudis, and because Israel and Saudi Arabia are our friends, really a problem for us as well. They're a problem anyway, in the sense that Iran is the one country in the region at the present time that understands its own mission or own purpose as to kind of challenge, right, American, whether it exists or not, but let's accept it for the moment, America's hegemony, or let's say America's preponderance, or just America's preferences for the regional order, right? Iran has now, since the invasion of Iraq, where Iraq was doing this as well, and Syria is taken out of the game for the most part, Iran really is the regional power, would-be power, who sees itself as challenging U.S. preferences and U.S. alliances, and sees that all as this cast of characters arrayed against it, exaggeratedly in some part, but not completely so. And then the other thing, whether it will be on the agenda or not, but it's always mattered. It's mattered almost more than oil in the following way. The Saudis have to sell their oil. There was nothing the United States ever had to do to get the Saudis to sell oil on the world market, because they're going to do it anyway, just like every other oil producer has, because they need the revenues that oil produces. But what the United States did get from Saudi Arabia, and this didn't have to happen, and that starts in the 1970s, after the so-called oil crisis of 73, the United States gets this commitment of the Saudis to take their oil revenues, what were called petrodollars at the time, right? This tremendously expanded amount of dollars that the Saudis were earning for their now new higher priced oil, along with OPEC. Well, what were they going to do with these dollars? Well, the Americans got them to commit to investing in basically U.S. debt. in treasury bonds. And we organized special arrangements with the Saudis. It was secret at the time. No country, except I think Germany got this deal at some point. No country got special arrangements to invest in U.S. Treasury bills before, and the Saudis did. And the Saudis sunk, I mean, literally billions of dollars inside the United States to support basically the price of the dollar, which was great for banks, which were the intermediaries in all of this stuff, great for balance of payments, and really, really great for the Treasury during a decade of financial turmoil. And that arrangement, remains to this day, augmented by the fact that the Saudis invest privately in all sorts of areas of the United States. In infrastructure services, every one of my Houston friends who has gone there to kind of help in oil field services or to build big buildings, it's invested in universities, it's invested in high tech. Saudi private individuals are big owners in U.S. firms, sectors, et cetera. I mean, in the real estate markets, et cetera. So the Saudis have invested in the United States over decades, and that certainly hasn't changed.
Yeah, one note about the arms sales, to your earlier point, Saudi Arabia has spent $90 billion since 1950 on U.S. armaments. There's something else here hanging over, needless to say, the president's trip to Saudi Arabia. I mean, a few years ago, maybe a decade ago, a trip by a president to the kingdom would not have been all that newsworthy. But the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, President Biden, when he was a candidate, said that he would make Saudi Arabia a pariah. What's your take on the pushback Biden has been getting about setting aside human rights for what some call realism?
Well, who's he getting pushback from? Okay,
members of his own party.
So Exactly. And there's a segment of that party, if you want, that historically would have been pushing back on him even harder, but instead have come to embrace Mohammed bin Salman. So the people who are pushing him back are the progressives, right? The AOCs, the Black Caucus, Bernie's advisor, the human rights community for sure. Big part missing from that pushback, for lack of a better term, the Israeli lobby, right? AIPAC, et cetera. Historically, those who criticize U.S. policy toward Saudi Arabia the most in the United States historically were those folks whose concern, above all other concerns, was the security of Israel. Because Saudis were understood as this major threat to Israeli security through their support of the Palestinians and so forth, et cetera.
Yeah, how times have changed.
I don't have very many good things to say about Mohammed bin Salman, and I don't want to exaggerate the extent to which he figured this one out, but someone's got to give him credit. By reaching out to the Israelis and Israeli supporters and sanctioning the involvement of the Emirates with the Israelis and so forth, and seeing Israelis quietly and so forth, he single-handedly has wiped away what has historically been the largest source of pressure against the U.S.-Saudi relationship. I can trace that back to the 1940s, but every decade, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, when the Reagan administration wanted to sell AWACS planes to Saudi Arabia, he was being completely beaten up by what the Washington Post called two factions in the United States. And this is a direct quote from the Washington Post, 1980, the neocons and the Jews. Right? I wouldn't have used those terms, but that's the term Hoagland used in one of his op-eds. So that source of challenge is gone, right? So I think, yes, there's pressure on Biden, et cetera, but in the end, right? Imagine Biden gets some positives from this. In the end, his own party's going to have to accept it. Right? And I don't know what the quid pro quo is going to be, some kind of statement on Yemen. Maybe that's what Bernie Sanders has been seeking, but it's not going to be really costly to him. And what to me is the Republicans haven't been saying much about this because the Republicans hate Biden so much that I'm sure it will become fodder for some segments of the Republican Party down the road. I listen to Steve Bannon a lot.
Oh.
He's starting to talk about this. But in general, if you think about it, the Trump administration and its transactional relationship with Saudi Arabia was something that people were kind of happy about. So
and Trump was honest about it. Sorry to interrupt, but he was asked about this by reporters. He basically said Saudi Arabia buys a lot of our weapons. Why would we want to mess up that business? Other politicians are afraid afraid of saying that because we're dealing with, well, the murder of a human being here.
They're buying hundreds of billions of dollars worth of things from this country. If I say we don't want to take your business, if I say we're going to cut it off, they will get the equipment, military equipment and other things from Russia and China. Russia and China would be very, very happy because right now we're doing very well against China. We're doing very well against everybody, including Russia, and I'm going to keep it that way. And I'm not going to tell a country that's spending hundreds of billions of dollars and has helped me do one thing very importantly, keep oil prices down so that they're not going to $100 and $150 a barrel.
And the Republican right are much more behind the idea of countering Iran, right? And Saudi Arabia is a part of that project. So I think whatever happens, Biden's going to get his enemies outside his party are going to beat him up a little bit. But it's hard to imagine in advance, right, the Republicans themselves or key factions of them kind of really fretting about this. They themselves think that, in some sense, the United States made mistakes. It pulled out of the region too much. It's stupidly going back to try to cut the nuclear deal with Iran. This really troubles the Republican right. So I think it's safer for him than pursuing some other kinds of foreign policy initiatives. And of course, he's been beaten up tremendously on some of his foreign policy initiatives, right? We've got Afghanistan, then they think he's done the wrong thing in Ukraine, he's wasting money in Ukraine, and he's not paying attention to China. All those things seem to be higher up in the agenda of the opposition party than Saudi Arabia is. And a murder of a journalist, Khashoggi, who back in 2017 when that happened, was being described as a secret Muslim brother and, and not really a liberal and all sorts of things. Lots of folks weren't bothered by it. The Washington Post was.
Some folks have simply had fun watching Biden eat his words, and maybe he shouldn't have made those remarks in that debate when he talked about making Saudi Arabia a pariah. One last point before we leap into the history here about Saudi Arabia and the Israelis and how things have changed. The disappearance of the Palestinian issue, when at one point in history Saudi Arabia stopped selling its oil to the United States because of that conflict, is no longer an irritant, and I'm sure the Palestinians feel, betrayed by all of this.
In the Persian Gulf, among the leaders, absolutely true. If these were free countries and we could do surveys of them, we might find a more complicated story. Certainly every one of my, let's say, Arab intellectual friends will insist, no, this is exaggerated. Palestine is still the cause célèbre of the entire Arab world, etc. Let's leave that question aside. For these elites at the present time, they have bigger fish to fry, and Israel is seen as a potential ally in meeting their real security threats and serving their security needs. Look, I have a friend who's Israel's probably leading expert on Saudi Arabia. I swear, he's hoping he's going to become the first ambassador to Riyadh at some point.
The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, founded in 1932, and the relationship with the United States begins almost immediately, but it wasn't a political one per se. It was the U.S. oil industry, right, that established ties with the kingdom. How would you describe the nature of the relationship between these two countries at this point, and when did it begin to change?
I would say, I would invite you to tell me, because the relationship was really so concentrated. It was first 2 and then 4 oil firms who had investments in all sorts of places, but came together in a consortium that became known as Aramco, right? And they had the exclusive rights to explore and produce Saudi Arabian oil from the 1930s. And they had a 70-year contract that was going to allow them to do that. And they were in control of all decisions about how much oil to pump out of the ground, where to sell it to, how to distribute it, at what price. And they did that in a time, right? This is the 30s, 40s, 50s, when production really takes off, when the world oil market looks quite different from the way it does today. So you can go on the trading floor today and trade oil futures, right? There's an oil futures market and there's an oil spot market that's like markets for every other commodity. That didn't exist in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. The world oil market was quite different. And so these 4 firms had tremendous amount of influence on what is going to be done with Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabian oil, in order to produce that oil, they had to do tremendous amount of investments inside the oil province to make it possible to pump that oil, to have workers there who would do the work for them, create the infrastructure for getting the oil to market, to creating towns where Saudi workers could live, where the workers coming from about 6 or 7 or 8 different countries to satisfy the oil industry could be housed, etc. They were basically like a department or a ministry that we would understand it in the modern terms, mainly responsible for development in the entire oil region of Saudi Arabia. So those are 4 firms. And the United States government had very little connection to Saudi Arabia. So if you said the kingdom was founded in 1932, our only diplomatic representative for the next 15 years was stationed in Cairo. And he would sometimes go over and like check out Saudi Arabia. The very first consulate that's set up in Saudi Arabia is only set up in the 40s and is dependent on the oil company for the housing of the diplomats and so forth. The state-to-state relations are very tenuous at that time.
And just
the firms drive it.
Yeah, just briefly here, what was oil used for in the 1930s? I mean, there weren't automobiles all over the place like there is today. No. Navies used oil. I mean, it was an important commodity, but not to the dimensions of today.
There's increasing world demand for oil, for military uses, for transportation, for the production of electricity. I mean, we are in the world of flight at that point, and you need jet fuel, et cetera, and so forth. So
that's right. I don't want to make it sound like it was the Middle Ages there, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it is not. But the key thing was, right, what was key about Saudi Arabian oil was it was tremendously inexpensive to produce. So if you were living in the 1930s in the United States, if you were lucky enough to have a car or you were accessing oil some way, your oil was generally coming from Texas, roughly, or California and so forth. And oil was pretty expensive to produce in California and Texas. Oil in Saudi Arabia was tremendously inexpensive to produce, about 10 cents a barrel versus about $1 a barrel for the equivalent sources in the United States. That means the firms that had access to that oil, right, and were going to sell it on a world market, was going to sell it to whatever buyers on this market that they controlled, that means they pocketed tremendous amount more profit, right? So they gave Saudis themselves very, very little of the profit that came from the production of that oil. Or to put it another way, for about 20 years or more, one of the main conflicts between the rising Saudi Arabian government and its technocratic ministries versus the oil company is who's getting the largest share of those tremendous profits that are being generated from Saudi oil. And it took a long while for the Saudis to kind of win greater shares of that. And that's partly the story about OPEC being founded and so forth. Mm-hmm. But these 4 firms, basically Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, and Texaco, are making tremendous profits from this investment, basically. And here's the other kind of funny thing about it. Most of that oil was never allowed to come to the United States because domestic oil producers were fearful that if the firms were able to ship that oil into the United States, giving the consumers, the benefit of this like cheaper oil, it would wreck the domestic industries. And as Saudi production started to take off, Republican administrations in the 1950s set up barriers against import of Saudi Arabian oil. And we know what comes about from that, right? If you're not letting imported oil in and you're using up your domestic oil, 20 years down the road, we're going to discover, hey, those oil fields are not producing as much oil anymore and prices are going up. And all of a sudden we have the beginnings of what will get to be called the oil crisis, the energy crisis of the late 60s and early 70s, because we were protected from that cheap Saudi oil.
That's very interesting. I remember reading Daniel Yergin's The Prize some years ago, where he talks about how if it weren't for U.S. oil, the Allies would have had a hard time winning World War II.
And World War I.
That's right.
Same.
I was probably a little off when I was discussing the prevalence of automobiles before in my poorly stated question to you. There were about 8 million cars in the U.S. in 1919, but by 1929, so just a few years before the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was established, 25 million or so cars. So that's a significant number.
Yeah.
So 1945 is the first time an American president meets the King of Saudi Arabia, who I believe was Mohammed bin Salman's grandfather. I don't want to get the family tree screwed up here.
Yes.
That's right.
Grandfather.
So 1945, Franklin Roosevelt meets the Saudi king, as you just explained. Before this, U.S. oil companies, the oil consortiums, international consortiums, were the players in Saudi Arabia. What spurs an American president to make political ties a reality?
So do you want the real story or the fiction, that has come to be believed since 9/11? Well, the real story is, it's pretty straightforward. The Americans started to produce some aid for Saudi Arabia, trucks, money, minting some gold coins for them in the midst of World War II, because here was this guy, the king, who had granted this concession unprecedentedly to United States oil firms, right, in a region where, most of the oil firms were British or Dutch, with some Americans, but the British played the major role, and British power was predominant throughout the Gulf. And here were these American firms that were running Saudi Arabia in some sense. Well, so Roosevelt's administration, they were reluctant to do it at first, but pushed by the oil companies and convinced that maybe Ibn Saud would not survive if they hadn't given him some aid. They gave him some financial aid, minuscule amounts, made him eligible for Lend-Lease funds, which was the means by which the United States, before it entered World War II, aided its allies, Great Britain most importantly, but a little bit of resources for Saudi Arabia. So as a result, the Americans wanted the Saudis to declare war on Germany before the end of the war, and by that means joining what got called the United Nations, right? The countries that were allied against the Axis powers in World War II were the United Nations. And we were soon to get a new international organization called the UN. Well, the Americans wanted the Saudis to sign on to that. So that was one thing they wanted Ibn Saud to do. And he did. Okay, declares war on Germany that month in February after seeing Roosevelt. The second thing that Roosevelt wanted, and he didn't get what he wanted this time, is that he needed the king's help, he told the king, in this kind of very rudimentary way. I mean, it's kind of like if you read the transcripts of those conversations, it's like an explorer meeting with some chieftain from a Native American tribe in the 19th century, and that's how they described Ibn Saud. But basically, they wanted Ibn Saud's help on a rising problem in a place called Palestine, where Roosevelt was getting a lot of pressure from the Democratic Party base to support the migration of displaced people, at the end of World War II.
Jewish homeland.
From the concentration camp into what will become Israel, into Palestine. And he's getting pressure on that front. Meanwhile, he's getting pressure from the oil companies and stuff, sort of saying, if you do this, we're going to lose our concessions and so forth, right? So this is like a burgeoning problem for the Roosevelt administration, and it will be for Truman afterwards. And Roosevelt wanted Ibn Saud to agree not to oppose that kind of policy. Ibn Saud did not agree to it. They basically agreed to disagree on Palestine, but Roosevelt made this famous promise to him, which we then broke with impunity for whatever, because we could do that, which was that he promised Ibn Saud that the United States would not take any kind of significant measure on behalf of the refugees to Palestine without consulting Ibn Saud first. So they kind of left it at that, but then we find out that Roosevelt was pretty bummed. Who is this two-bit king who's not paying attention to me? And plus, he didn't seem to understand things very much. I mean, Roosevelt got grumpy and left, okay? And that's the story. No president ever meets Ibn Saud again. No one travels to Saudi Arabia. Ibn Saud doesn't ever come to the United States. He's old and frail. They would occasionally meet his son, the Crown Prince, and Eisenhower was the first president to host formally the Crown Prince in roughly 1953. But my point is, state-to-state relations were pretty hands-off for the next 10, 15 years at the level of, Washington policy. Basically, things were taken care of by the oil company, the things that mattered most. As the region grew more complicated, as kings started to be overthrown in the 1950s, as Republican radical administrations were appearing, as Nasser comes into Egypt, etc. I mean, all of a sudden, the region starts to seem a little bit more in turmoil, and we are going to pursue a slightly closer relationship. But really, the relationship only starts to become close with Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s. So what I want to say about that is so many fictions have been created about that meeting with Roosevelt and Ibn Saud. Here are some of them: that we agreed to arm the Saudis at that time. We founded a security partnership with Saudi Arabia at that time. We traded oil for security. All of that is made up. There's no documentation of it. And here's what I discovered, and I still can't kind of get over it, because I've been working on the Middle East for, since the 1970s or 80s. We've all come to believe in that meeting, between Roosevelt and Ibn Saud as the start of the U.S.-Saudi special relationship. It goes back 70 years. No one ever said that. There's no book about the United States and Saudi Arabia that says anything like that until after 9/11. And then all of a sudden, this story starts to be created about, the relationship was a deep and abiding one, and it wasn't just about oil, it was about security and so forth. Well, there was a reason why folks were saying that after 9/11, yes, because you remember this as well as I do. At no time since the 1970s had more light been cast, right, on this so-called relationship than in 9/11, when it turned out that 15 of the 19 hijackers, right? So there were no arms given to the Saudis. There was no defense agreement with the Saudis. Here's the crazy thing about that. Great Britain still armed and trained Saudi Arabia for the next decade. But no one ever says that. Everyone just repeats this. Roosevelt started this deep security relationship, and in return, we were promised oil. Also made up, because the oil was flowing.
It wasn't up to the king to promise that oil, really.
He could break the promise, and that was going to be a problem. But in other words, there was a contract. Yes. There were concessions that the American companies had. The oil was flowing, and the king was happy as a clam, except for one thing. Every year, he wanted more and more profits from the oil industry, because his kingdom was getting bigger and bigger. He was spending it like crazy and was in constant arrears. The oil company was being forced to do things like lend him money, etc. So the oil company was desperate to get the American government to play more of a role inside the kingdom so it could step back from all these extra functions it was having to do, because there wasn't a real relationship. There wasn't foreign aid and so forth.
They wanted to protect their concessions. Go ahead.
So I would sort of say we've exaggerated this like crazy since 9/11, and now it's 20 years later, and it's just become a fact that everyone believes. High school exams ask the question, people repeat it and so forth, but it just didn't happen.
And I'll just make one other point about the issue of concessions. Mm-hmm. Similar situations playing out at the same time in Iran. The British have, a concession for the ages to pump Iranian oil, and that, of course, leads Mossadegh to nationalize Iran's oil and a CIA coup, but we won't digress about that, although it is part of this picture. In my own view of things, my own understanding has always been that the U.S.-Saudi relationship really starts taking on its modern form, if you will, in the 1970s. So why don't we go to 1973 and the oil embargo and the shock that caused?
You're absolutely right. It's the 1970s that matter. And those events are part of that story. But the key part, why it comes to matter more, is that you mentioned Mossadegh in Iran in the 1950s and the cost that he paid for nationalizing the oil fields, right? Well, that story is over by the 1970s. Everywhere in the world, producing states are nationalizing the foreign private companies that are producing their oil, and they're doing that successfully. And that includes Saudi Arabia. So the oil firms that were central to the story from the 1930s to the 1970s are no longer the central players.
Interesting. So my digression wasn't a digression at all. Go ahead.
No, it was absolutely key. So the embargo, so many myths and fictions about that embargo exist as well, that we want to be careful. Number one is you can do the search yourself. They think there was a thing called OPEC an OPEC embargo. It's absolutely not true. The organization OPEC never embargoed the United States or anyone else. 4 of 5 Arab producing states in OPEC, right, declared an embargo, a partial embargo of the United States, then a total embargo of the United States in that moment in October, ostensibly to demonstrate their anger with the United States and allegiance with Syria and Egypt that were currently at war with Israel. The 1973 war, that's when I started going to college. I remember this well, and I was commuting to college during the gas lines. This was the way Arab oil-producing states could demonstrate, I'm sure it was a genuine anger, with what was transpiring on the ground in the Sinai, et cetera, because in that war, though it looked like a spectacular victory for the Arab confrontation states for a few days, after a few weeks, with tremendous amount of military aid from the United States, the Israelis turned the tide, and that victory didn't look like much of a victory anymore. And what the Arab oil-producing countries said was, well, we're going to punish the United States for this by cutting off their oil.
So then is it correct to deduce that because of this embargo, well, the United States was really dependent on this oil at this point in history, so it hurt American consumers?
No. This is my term. I'm a historically a left-wing scholar, but I will be sounding like a libertarian conservative, in the next point. But, the libertarians get some things right sometimes, and this is one of them. So about the embargo, we believe, right, and again, as we move farther and farther away from that moment, it just becomes not a kind of carefully constructed history, but like a kind of set piece or mythos, like we believe in, a Paul Revere's Ride, et cetera, or any other kind of myth. So we think there was some crisis caused by this thing called the embargo. We have proof of it, don't we? The prices were going up and there were gas lines. It must be because there were oil shortages. Okay. The prices were going up, okay, not because of an embargo originally, it's because just like today, just like we're witnessing now, there's a war going on that's cutting off or reducing supply of oil or worrying those who need that oil about future supply disruptions. And so they're bidding the price up like crazy.
This is a global commodity.
And that's really key, okay? The number 2, what about those gas lines? Well, there were gas lines in 1969 and 70 and 71, which we forget about, et cetera. The gas lines were a function of the fact that the Nixon administration had imposed price controls and took over distribution of the domestic stocks prior to the October War, prior to the embargo, et cetera, and kept those in place. It's that administrative set of rules and regulations, et cetera, that we forget about now that were really responsible for the gas lines. So 2 other countries were embargoed along with the United States, the Netherlands, South Africa, and Portugal, finally, okay? So it seems like a random set of countries. The key thing is the Netherlands were embargoed, major oil consumer. There were never gasoline lines in the Netherlands during this whole crisis. Why? Because there wasn't this whole administrative structure that had been put in place inside the United States. By the way, that administrative structure stays in place until when? 1980 in the Reagan administration. So you get gas lines again in 1979 with the Iran crisis. Have you ever seen a gas line again in the United States after 1980? Yeah. No. And one more thing, just to kind of put one more pin into the bubble of this idea of the embargo. Yes, the Saudis announced an embargo of the United States for a few short months, but the single largest consumer of Saudi oil in the United States was the U.S. military, involved in a war in Vietnam at that point, right? No problem getting the oil to the military throughout that crisis. Wow. So the crisis, it was a lot of theater, okay? The United States was never in short supply for oil at that time. It could meet all its demand through private stocks. Unfortunately, a lot of the private firms did not want to sell their oil when the Nixon administration was, imagine this, the Nixon administration is fixing the price that oil can be sold to refiners at, X, let's say, right? Where if they could sell it on the world market, they'd be getting price Z. The rational thing for you, if you were an oil refiner at the time, would be to hold on to those stocks and not sell them because you're going to make a bigger profit going forward, et cetera. So the oil was there, but the administrative impediments to getting it to market were the problem. And the other thing that the oil companies did, they didn't want to run afoul of the Saudis and the other oil producers who they were dependent on, but they had the ability to move oil around, okay? So they carefully made sure that no Saudi crude came to the United States. But did they double up on, say, the amount of Iraqi crude that came or Iranian crude, right? Because the Iranians were loving this. They were selling the United States all the oil we wanted under the Shah at inflated prices. The prices had gone up. The Iranians love this stuff. So it's not like the U.S. was cut off from world oil supply at the time, and we had enough there. There was a remarkable MIT economist who was an iconoclast, and he said something like this: an oil country cannot stop oil sales to one country without stopping oil sales to all countries. Oil is just going to be shifted and moved around. Yeah. And he was absolutely right. And each of the embargoers, stopped very quietly, got some, quid pro quo or not.
Yeah, I mean, they need to sell their oil. My understanding has always been that the initial oil shock of 73 and then the second one in 1979 caused by the Iranian Revolution, where basically Iranian oil production goes to zero, that the lessons from those two shocks, if you will, the United States cannot allow this region to have this kind of instability. We need to protect it. We're too dependent on this oil to leave it to chance.
Well, yes, but one more thing. It is like taking on faith that the United States has some capacity to do something, under circumstances of an Iranian revolution and so forth, that somehow would prevent a crisis like this from occurring in the future. Well, we don't. So yes, this was the ostensible logic behind an increasing presence of U.S. military in the Gulf, particularly right after the Reagan administration. Yes, Jimmy Carter starts it and so forth. But after the Reagan administration, when all that administrative stuff is dismantled, and talk about energy independence. It's a fiction, but Jimmy Carter liked to talk about we're going to be independent.
We must not be selfish or timid if we hope to have a decent world for our children and our grandchildren. We simply must balance our demand for energy with our rapidly shrinking resources.
To the Reagan administration, which basically embraces a neoliberal economic freeing, et cetera, and advance the military might of the United States slowly into the region. Why? Well, for a number of reasons. Yes, the Shah was a great friend of the United States, and not only was he buying the weapons like the Saudis do now, he was the head of a very large, reliable administrative state that could do good works for the United States, like be part of the United States defense position inside the Middle East in a way that the Saudis never could at the time, and frankly, still can't really.
Yeah, Shah was the most important U.S. ally in the Middle East during this period.
Absolutely.
I think this point, 79, 80, early 80s, the creation of CENTCOM, I think was in 83 or 84, is really important to explaining how this marriage developed. Because it was at this time, and if anyone listens to Jimmy Carter's 1980 State of the Union address, it's basically a declaration of war against anyone who might interfere with the global oil supply.
Let our position be absolutely clear. An attempt by any outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region will be regarded as an assault on the vital interest of the United States of America and such an assault will be repelled by any means necessary, including military force.
who was going to interfere, right? We forget this, right? This is the other part of the story, not 1979 in the Shah. The Soviets had just invaded Afghanistan. Well, this is going to get constructed in Washington by the intellectuals and policy activists around Reagan as the first step in what was obviously the Russian plan to take over the Persian Gulf. And by taking over the Persian Gulf, undermining the United States defense posture with who? With its allies in Western Europe and Japan. This was this like great strategic vision that folks operated under, that the Russians were headed there. And if they did that, the whole capitalist free world will collapse, because the Japanese and the Europeans, who are dependent on the Persian Gulf oil much more than the United States, would have to kind of abandon NATO, give up its alliance with the West, and sign on to the Soviets. Now, you know, we could agree to disagree to precisely how fantastic that vision was, yes, or crazy that vision was. Because remember, that was a Soviet state in decline, a Soviet state that increasingly was doing what in order to produce the revenues it needed to support its military in its arms confrontation with the United States. What was it doing? It was starting to sell oil. Here's my other moment of neoconservatism or conservative angle. Douglas Feith, who was a Reagan administration official, right? And then moved on to become, I don't want to call him an architect of the 2003 invasion, but a player in the Reagan and in the Bush years. Douglas Feith always argued that there was nothing you had to do, specially, right, to guarantee oil. It was just going to flow, right? You didn't have to protect it in any way. His point was you don't want to kowtow to the OPEC and the Arabs. Doug Feith was a good supporter of Israel at the time. He thought the Reagan administration, others were embracing the Arabs too much, and you didn't really need to do anything like that. But at the same time, there was this like fantastic vision that the Russians were going to come down from Afghanistan and take over the oil fields. Well, Douglas Feith calls that the risk game view of the world. I'm sure you played Risk when you were a kid, and you're moving around and you're controlling the world. So it's only the world resembles Risk, like, you know, where you can go from one place to another, no problem, etc. Yeah. Could you conjure a fantasy that somehow the Soviets were going to take over the Persian Gulf, which everyone understood to be a vital U.S. interest and would be, you know, kind of would lead to world war? Basically, right?
Yeah, there's a schizophrenia in there in that analysis, right?
Yeah.
So, Bob, we're talking about this key turning point here, late 70s, early 80s, and the U.S. militarization of the Middle East. And I think it'll come as a surprise maybe to some of our younger listeners who have only known the Middle East as a place where the United States is fighting unwinnable, endless wars. As of 1990, despite all that, there's only one military base, U.S. military base in the Middle East as of 1990. That is in Bahrain. And the Saudis were among the opponents of having a permanent military presence, U.S. presence there. What happens? Well, we kind of know what happens. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, but why don't you pick it up from there?
Sure. Now, you know, the question becomes, the thing that has been debated from 1990 onwards is the Americans had to go to the king. And I think Tom Friedman was on that trip, or if not that trip, one that came right after that. But, you know, in that time is when Tom Friedman makes his first trip to the Gulf. But they basically have to convince King Fahd, supposedly, to understand the threat that Saddam Hussein posed. He's invaded Kuwait. The question becomes, is he stopping in Kuwait or is he moving forward? You can either accept the idea that King Fahd was convinced of that, or the Americans pull the wool over their eyes. It would seem to me, you know, if I was Fahd under those circumstances, I would have been worried too. You don't take chances at that moment. This was the end of the Cold War. And here was the state Iraq. I mean, it's basically doing what Putin did now, right? The idea is, for decades, you can't name another country that was swallowed up by one, right? But here was Saddam Hussein, Iraq, basically sort of saying, Kuwait no longer exists. It's mine. It's a province of Iraq from here on in. Well, that's a pretty bold move, signaling how he understands the post-Cold War order, et cetera. And so it made perfect sense to me that the large coalition that came together to stop and reverse that intervention was rational. You don't really want countries coming around swallowing other countries.
If this tin pot dictator is allowed to do it, then who else thinks they'll be allowed to do it?
And now add to that all the crazy things we believe about oil. And so, at that moment in 1990 and from there on in, it was, if Saddam gets the oil, he's going to own all of it, and he's going to destroy the United States, or he's going to destroy the Western world, as if the world market didn't exist, as if he didn't need Western oil companies to help him, and so forth. So there's this fantasy element around this question, this traumatic relationship Americans have with oil and geopolitics, et cetera, that's feeding into that.
Iraq itself controls some 10% of the world's proven oil reserves. Iraq plus Kuwait controls twice that. And Iraq, permitted to swallow Kuwait, would have the economic and military power, as well as the arrogance, to intimidate and coerce its neighbors who control the lion's share of the world's remaining oil reserves. We cannot permit a resource so vital to be dominated by one so ruthless.
But yes, Saddam swallowed a country, a reliable ally, a roughly reliable ally of the United States, important oil producer. So yes, the United States convinces King Fahd to allow U.S. military to move into Saudi Arabia. And you're absolutely right that represents a new stage, right, in the United States, not only its relationship with Saudi Arabia, with the region. Because yes, we had been starting to experience violent reactions to us, right? First and foremost in Lebanon in the 1980s, where there were the first car bombings and so forth, et cetera. But after 1990 and the United States presence in Saudi Arabia, after it grows exponentially, the United States obviously faces more and deeper threats going forward.
Yeah, a young Saudi named Osama bin Laden did not appreciate, although he exaggerated about the presence of the United States in the kingdom, but not to digress about bin Laden. So the United States militarizes, to use that term again, its presence in the Middle East. There are now dozens of bases there. The 9/11 attacks happen, and in retrospect, that seems like an opportunity, or could have been an opportunity, for the United States to say, enough is enough, especially if what you've been saying about our supposed dependence on their oil is correct. Why didn't the 9/11 attacks, which were perpetrated by Saudi hijackers, Saudi Arabia, the country that was exporting Wahhabism to places like Afghanistan, why didn't that do in the marriage?
I can't tell you why, but I can tell you this, that every crisis people have predicted, well, two things. The thing they like to predict the most is the royal family is going down, right? And that's a prediction that's been made routinely every 5 or 6 years since about 1949. And then there is the United States-Saudi relationship will deconstruct. Certainly at that moment, there were folks who were arguing quite forcefully for that, right? On the left, you had someone like Michael Moore. Now, guys, it's 20 plus years away, but Michael Moore made the still best-selling documentary of that time that ostensibly exposed how the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia led to 9/11 in the course of hoping that it was going to end that relationship. And of course, on the right, you had voices, all sorts of voices in the Pentagon and so forth, or in the administration, that were trying to push. Well, there were even people calling for invasion of Saudi Arabia and, the overthrow of the Al Saud, et cetera. But that didn't happen.
Yeah, they invaded Iraq where there were no hijackers, but no, not to simplify it.
That is correct. They did. Well, roughly, the hijackers, let's be honest about this. For the elites, the hijackers were an inconvenience. Right? For ordinary Americans, it drove them crazy. It drove my father crazy. It's driven my sister crazy. People still want to see justice for the victims of 9/11, et cetera. But I think, when you're part of the foreign policy blob, you quickly argue there are many more interests here at stake. It's unfortunate, et cetera, but we really rely on the Saudis. And the Saudis worked overtime to reassure the United States at that current moment. Gifts of all sorts, increased intelligence cooperation, and so forth, connections to the CIA. I hate to tell you this, but the Council on Foreign Relations was enlisted in a campaign to demonstrate how Saudi Arabia has always meant much more for the United States security than just oil. And you could read a book that was produced by the Council at that time. It's called Thicker Than Oil, right? Subsidized by the Saudis, informed carefully by Prince Turki El Faisal, the ex-intelligence chief of Saudi Arabia, to demonstrate, right? The Saudis have always denied, for decades, denied any involvement in things like Iran-Contra, helping the United States in its covert interventions everywhere. After 9/11, they started revealing it like crazy to show what good friends we were with the Americans and how close we were to them and how important we were. And it's not just oil, and of course it's arms sales and so forth. So, the Saudis have a lot of backers on both sides of the aisle, more on the Republicans and the Democrats.
And they've always seemingly had some deniability when it comes to terrorists from Saudi Arabia. I mean, the Saudi royal family and the government there says, we didn't directly train these people, although we know in the 1980s there was support from the Saudi government in cooperation with the United States to get jihadists into Afghanistan, to give them money and arms.
For sure. And it created the blowback that threatened, I would say this, threatened the Saudis much more than it threatened the United States. Most of those jihadists who came back from Afghanistan did not understand themselves as part of the global mission like bin Laden. And they were really targeting the Saudis themselves. So the Saudis had much more of a security problem than the United States. But isn't that all? I mean, it's always a kind of story of foreign policy, right? The Israelis helped create a religious counterweight to oppose the Palestinian Liberation Organization that emerges as Hamas, which is now its biggest threat.
So this has been an amazing discussion, and I'm sitting here thinking, why does it seem that the Saudis have leverage over the United States when we're the world superpower, if you will, and they're an economically backward country? They're not a democracy. We do not need their oil as much as we have convinced ourselves we do. So why does it seem like such a one-sided relationship?
Well, I don't...
Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong.
I would say, where's the leverage? What are they getting us to do that we otherwise wouldn't do?
That's a good point.
It's not like from the start, I would say this, and increasingly in the 1970s, like you imagine, the Saudis understand they need the United States to guarantee their security. But it's a gamble. On the one hand, they have to hope that's true, right? But imagine this, if you're in the situation of extreme vulnerability, you're also pissed off about it all the time, or angry about it, or have second thoughts about it. It also drives you crazy. So it's this like schizophrenia that the Saudis themselves experience that drive a lot of the kind of US-Saudi day-to-day stuff. Why they'll say no sometimes, while they'll insult Biden, right? It's that vulnerability that leads them in that direction. They could push the Americans in areas that ultimately don't matter very much, but seem like, and we take the slights, right? Because after all, we're the great imperial power, the predominant power, or the great democracy, or the world's leading power. And we don't like little states that say no all the time. And, I think Biden's in that situation where, he got some pushback from MBS. Now they're going to kind of make up for this stuff. The same thing happened with George Bush and King Abdullah. In 1999 and 2000, Abdullah felt like completely betrayed by George Bush because Bush did not go along with his Middle East peace plan. And Abdullah was arguing he was going to wash his hands of the Americans, et cetera. Bush had to go there, make nice, et cetera. And it's really with 9/11 that things changed. So this is another turn of the wheel of a very long, sorry, I'm messing up the metaphor, but you get it.
Yeah,
another turn of the wheel of an old device.
Bob Vitalis of the University of Pennsylvania, thank you for a tour de force of U.S.-Saudi relations. On the next episode of History as It Happens, the F word is back. Fascism. Is Vladimir Putin a fascist? We're going to speak to one of the world's leading scholars on that political phenomenon. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.